He took Magnolia, his own daughter, shy, lonely, and crushed by his insults, and forced her into a union with Ezra, the strongest enslaved man on the plantation. He thought it would solve his money problems and break them both in the process. But folks say Magnolia didn't act the way he expected. And Ezra? He didn't bow the way Silas demanded. Two people, both trapped under the same tyrant, began quietly working together in the shadows, learning each other's secrets, sharing danger, planning something the South had never seen. Because when a master tries to use fear to control love, hate, and hope all at once, he may create the very force that destroys him. And what Magnolia and Ezra did next didn't just shock the South, it changed everything. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The dawn came slow over Pritchard land, bleeding pink and gold across fields that hadn't known proper care in years. Silas Pritchard sat on his veranda, watching the sun climb with the same cold detachment a man might watch his own hanging. His coffee had gone bitter in the cup. He didn't notice. His attention stayed fixed on the papers spread before him like accusation itself. Bills, taxes, letters stamped with official seals. The last one, from the bank in Natchez, he'd read 3 times. Each reading made his stomach tighten another notch. They would not extend credit. They questioned his capacity to honor existing obligations. They suggested, in language carefully wrapped in professional courtesy, that he consider selling land, as if the Pritchard name meant nothing, as if 4 generations of stewardship over this earth could be undone by simple arithmetic. Silas's face flushed hot, despite the morning cool. His fingers trembled as he reached for the coffee, lifting the cup to lips that had gone dry. The liquid tasted like ash. Everything tasted like ash these days. Pride had a flavor, he'd learned. It tasted like choking. The cotton prices had dropped again. The last harvest barely covered operational costs. His neighbors whispered about him at church. He knew they did. Whispered about the crumbling manor, the overgrown gardens, the way Silas Pritchard's coat showed wear at the elbows now, the way his daughter never married, despite being well past the age. Magnolia. He set the cup down too hard. Liquid sloshed across a tax document, blurring the numbers. He didn't wipe it away. Magnolia! His voice carried across the veranda, through the open windows of the house. Magnolia, attend me at once. Inside, Magnolia Pritchard had been awake for hours. She always woke before dawn, lying in bed listening to the house settle around her like something dying in stages. She'd heard her father's footsteps on the veranda boards, heard the rustle of papers, the scrape of chair legs. She knew, with the instinct of someone who'd learned to read danger in small sounds, that today would bring something terrible. His summons confirmed it. She rose slowly, her body protesting movement the way it always did. 22 years old, and her knees already ached. Her back hurt. Her father said it was because she was fat. Said it often. Said it with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on weather. Said it was God's judgment on her weakness of character. Magnolia smoothed her dress with shaking hands. The fabric pulled tight across her middle. She'd let out the seams twice already. There was no more fabric to let. She walked to the veranda. Each step felt like approaching execution. Silas didn't look at her when she arrived. He kept his eyes on his papers, his jaw working like he was chewing something tough. "Father?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Sit." She sat. The silence stretched between them. Magnolia folded her hands in her lap and waited. She'd learned long ago not to speak until spoken to, learned that anticipation was its own punishment, and her father wielded it like other men wielded whips. Finally, Silas looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, Whether from drink or sleeplessness, she couldn't tell. Maybe both. The flush in his cheeks had darkened to something that looked almost like fury. "You know our situation," he said. It wasn't a question. Magnolia nodded anyway. "You know what people say about this family, about this house." His voice dropped lower, harder. "About you." Magnolia's throat closed. She nodded again. "Unmarriageable." The word hung in the air like rot. Too old now. Too unsuited for decent society. "I tried, Magnolia. God knows I tried to find you a match, but no man of quality will have you." Each word landed like a blow. Magnolia stared at her hands, her vision blurred. "You will serve this family," Silas continued, "in the only way left available to you." The blur became tears. "Father, you will provide me with an heir." The words didn't make sense at first. Magnolia looked up, confusion cutting through her humiliation. "But I'm not. There's no husband to—" "Ezra," Silas said flatly. "The big one from the South Fields. Strong stock, healthy. He'll do." The world tilted. Magnolia's mind went white, then filled with noise. A rushing sound like wind through dead trees. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "You're appalled." Silas's voice carried satisfaction now, cruel and sharp. "You think this beneath your dignity. But you have no dignity left, girl. You have nothing. You are nothing. You exist to serve the needs of this family, and by God, you will do so." "Please," the word tore out of her. "Please, Father, you cannot mean—" "I'll hear no more." Silas stood, gathering his papers with jerky movements. "Wesley!" The overseer appeared within seconds. He'd been listening, Magnolia realized. They all listened. The whole plantation would know by noon. "Fetch Ezra from the fields," Silas commanded. "Bring him here directly." Wesley grinned, actually grinned, and disappeared. Magnolia couldn't move. Her body had gone numb. She sat in her chair while her father paced the veranda, muttering about financial salvation and family obligations and the natural order of things. The words washed over her like poison water. When Ezra appeared, he was exactly as she'd seen him from her window 100 times before. Tall, powerfully built, his dark skin gleaming with sweat from morning work. He held his hat in his hands. His face showed nothing. Silas turned to him with the same casual authority he might use to direct the placement of furniture. "Ezra, you're being given a new responsibility." Silas gestured toward Magnolia without looking at her. "My daughter requires attendance. You will be moved to the cabin behind the smokehouse. She will join you there. You will perform your duty to this household." Ezra's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something Magnolia couldn't name. Rage? Fear? Resignation? "Master Pritchard." Ezra's voice was low, careful. "I don't understand what you're asking." "I'm not asking anything." Silas's face flushed darker. "I'm giving you an order. You will provide this family with a child. Do you understand that order?" The silence that followed felt alive, dangerous. "Yes, sir," Ezra said finally. Magnolia looked at him then, really looked, and found him looking back. Their eyes met across the space between them. In that moment, she saw her own horror reflected in his face, her own trapped helplessness, her own complete lack of choice. Two people who'd lived entire lives on the same land but in different worlds, seeing each other clearly for the first time, bound together by the same man's cruelty. "Father, please," Magnolia whispered. "This is madness. This is—" "Hysteria," Silas snapped. "Control yourself. This is settled. Wesley, see that the cabin is prepared. They take residence by sunset." He walked inside without another word. Magnolia stood slowly, her legs barely supporting her weight. Ezra remained where he was, statue still. Wesley was already moving away, calling instructions to someone Magnolia couldn't see. The day passed in fragments. Magnolia remembered being in her room, staring at her few belongings, remembered her hands shaking too badly to fold a dress properly, remembered the way light moved across the floor as hours crawled past like wounded things. By the time the sun began its descent, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow, someone came to collect her. Not her father. He didn't appear again. An enslaved woman named Ruth, who'd sometimes brought Magnolia meals, stood at her door with eyes full of pity. "It's time, Miss Magnolia." The walk to the cabin felt endless and too short all at once. Magnolia's vision swam. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Ruth steadied her twice when she stumbled. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, a bed, a table. Ezra stood in the doorway. He'd washed, changed clothes. His face remained unreadable. Ruth squeezed Magnolia's arm once, quick and gentle, then disappeared. Magnolia stood in the dirt yard. Ezra stood at the threshold. Neither spoke. The sun dropped below the horizon. Darkness began its slow claim on the world. Ezra stepped aside finally, a silent invitation. Magnolia climbed the single step, crossed into the cabin. The door closed behind them with a sound like thunder. The cabin smelled of old wood and dirt. An oil lamp flickered on the table, casting shadows that moved like living things across the walls. Magnolia sat on a three-legged stool near the fireplace, her back rigid, her hands clenched so tight in her lap that her knuckles showed white. She stared at the floor. Ezra stood by the window, as far from her as the small space allowed. He kept his arms at his sides, careful not to make any sudden movements. His mind raced through calculations, through all the ways this could become worse, through all the traps that might be waiting. White women were dangerous. That was a truth he'd learned before he could walk. They could lie, and their lies became reality. They could scream, and their screams meant death. They could point, and whatever they pointed at burned. But this one was crying. Quiet tears that she kept trying to wipe away with trembling fingers. Her breath hitched every few seconds, like something kept breaking inside her chest. "I'm sorry." Her voice came out strangled. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he would. That he could." She pressed both hands to her face. "Oh, God. Oh, God, what has he done?" Ezra didn't move. He waited. Words from white people were weapons. He'd learned to let them speak themselves out before responding. "I didn't ask for this," Magnolia continued. Her shoulders shook. "I would never— You must believe me. I would never willingly." She looked up at him then, her eyes red and swollen. "I am so sorry." Ezra studied her face. Fear lived there. Real fear, not the performed kind he'd seen white women use before. Her terror looked like his own, trapped animal terror, the kind that came from knowing you had no power over your own fate. "Miss Magnolia," he said carefully, keeping his voice low and neutral, "I ain't gonna hurt you." She flinched anyway. "I know what coercion is," Ezra continued. "Know it better than most folks, I reckon. You ain't gotta be afraid of me." Magnolia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her breath came in shaky gulps. "How can you be so? You should hate me." "You should—" "Hate you for what?" Ezra asked. "For being his daughter? For being in the same trap I'm in?" He moved slightly, just enough to lean against the wall. "We both got no choice in this. Difference is, I've been having no choice my whole life. You just learning what it feels like." The words came out harsher than he meant them. Magnolia went very still. "You're right," she whispered. "You're absolutely right. I've lived my whole life in that house, and I never truly understood." She looked at her hands. "My father is a monster. I know that now. I've always known it, but I was too frightened to name it properly." Ezra watched her carefully. Every instinct screamed not to trust her. Trust got you sold. Trust got you beaten. Trust got you killed. but something in her voice rang true. "There's things I've done," Magnolia said suddenly. "Things my father doesn't know about. Things I—" She looked up at him again. "I teach some of the children, the enslaved children, to read." Ezra's breath caught. "I know it's forbidden," she continued quickly. "I know the danger. But I couldn't. I can't bear the thought of them growing up in darkness, unable to see the world through letters and words. So I've been teaching them. Just a few. Just when I can manage it safely." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And I take food from the kitchen stores, hide it in places where I know they'll find it. Not much. Never enough to be noticed missing, but something." Ezra's mind reeled. He thought of little Sarah, who'd shown him scratches in the dirt 2 months back. Letters, she said, the sad lady had taught her. He'd assumed she meant one of the older enslaved women. "You been doing this long?" he asked. 3 years. Maybe longer. I lose track." Magnolia's hands twisted together. "I know it doesn't make up for anything. I know it doesn't change what this place is, what my family has." Her voice broke. "But I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in that house and pretend everything was normal while people suffered because of my father's greed." Ezra pushed away from the wall slowly. He moved toward the table, not toward her, just closer, and examined the cabin properly for the first time. The roof leaked in 2 places he could see. The floorboards were warped. The bed frame looked like it might collapse under weight. "This place needs work," he said. Magnolia blinked at the change in subject. "What?" "The cabin. It's falling apart." Ezra pointed at the ceiling. "Rain gonna come through there soon as the next storm hits. Floor's rotted in that corner. Bed ain't safe." He looked at her. "I can fix most of it. Got woodworking skills. Master Pritchard don't care much about what I do with my evening hours, long as morning work gets done." "Oh." Magnolia stood slowly, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. Yes, I suppose it does need repairs." "We gonna need boundaries too," Ezra said. "Clear ones. You sleep on that cot by the fireplace. I take the pallet against the far wall. We don't cross into each other's space without asking first. That fair?" Magnolia nodded quickly. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you." "Ain't about thanks." Ezra met her eyes. "It's about surviving this. Both of us." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something else. About my health." Ezra waited. My father calls it hysteria, but it's not. There's something wrong inside me. Has been for years. I bleed wrong. Hurt in ways that aren't normal." She pressed a hand to her stomach. "If I became pregnant, I don't think— The doctor told my father once that it would be very dangerous. My father dismissed it. Said the doctor was being overly cautious." Understanding settled in Ezra's chest like a stone. "He's trying to kill you." "I don't know if he means to," Magnolia whispered. "But I don't think he'd mourn if it happened. Then he could play the grieving father, collect sympathy, maybe even blame. Blame whoever he wanted to blame." Ezra's jaw tightened. The trap had more teeth than he'd realized. "We gonna have to be smart about this," he said. "Real smart." "Yes." Outside, night sounds filled the air. Crickets, distant voices, the rustle of wind through cotton fields. Inside the cabin, silence stretched between them like something fragile. Magnolia returned to her stool. Ezra moved to the far wall where he'd stacked a thin pallet and a single blanket. They didn't speak again. When Magnolia finally lay down on her cot, fully clothed, she stared at the ceiling and listened to Ezra's quiet breathing across the room. Her mind spun with everything that had happened, everything that might happen, all the terrible possibilities tomorrow could bring. But underneath the fear, something else stirred, something small and unexpected. For the first time in her life, someone had listened to her confession without judgment. Someone had looked at her actions, her small rebellions, and understood. Across the room, Ezra lay on his pallet, and thought about the scared white woman who taught enslaved children to read, who smuggled food, who apologized like she meant it. Who might actually be telling the truth? The morning air held a chill that would burn away by midday. Magnolia stepped out of the cabin first, her skirts damp from the dew-soaked grass. Ezra followed several paces behind, keeping the proper distance expected of him. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. Pink and orange bled across the horizon like watercolor paint. Magnolia walked with her arms wrapped around herself, though whether from cold or anxiety, Ezra couldn't tell. She didn't look back at him. She didn't speak. They moved across the grounds like two strangers who happened to be traveling the same path. The big house loomed ahead, white columns catching the early light. Ezra had built parts of that porch himself, had repaired the steps twice, had sanded the railings until his hands bled. It looked beautiful from a distance. Up close, you could see the cracks. A house servant named Ruth stood by the kitchen entrance. She was an older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. When she saw Magnolia approaching, her expression turned cold. "Miss Magnolia," Ruth said. Her voice carried no warmth. "Come to collect your things, I suppose?" "Yes," Magnolia said quietly. "I won't be long." "I expect not." Ruth stepped aside, but made no move to help. "Shameful business, if you ask me. No daughter of a respectable house should be living in." She cut herself off, but the damage was done. Magnolia's face flushed red. She hurried past without responding. Ezra kept his eyes on the ground as he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He knew better than to follow her inside. Knew better than to look directly at any of the white faces that might appear in the windows. He made himself small and still, the way he'd learned to do since childhood. Voices drifted from inside the house. Women's voices, sharp and cutting. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone told him everything. Magnolia was being torn apart with words disguised as concern. She emerged 15 minutes later, carrying a small trunk and a cloth bag. Her eyes were red, but dry. She'd stopped crying somewhere between the foyer and the front door. "I'll take that, miss," Ezra said, reaching for the trunk. Magnolia handed it over without meeting his eyes. "Thank you." Ruth appeared in the doorway again. "Master Pritchard wants you in the timber yard, Ezra. He's got work lined up for you today." "Yes'm." Magnolia started back toward the cabin alone. Ezra watched her go for just a moment before turning toward the timber yard. The trunk and bag would have to wait in the cabin entrance until later. The timber yard sat on the eastern edge of the property, where tall pines grew thick enough to block the morning sun. Ezra found the other men already there, axes in hand, sweat already darkening their shirts despite the early hour. He took his place among them and began the work. The rhythm came easy: swing, bite, pull, swing, bite, pull. The wood split with satisfying cracks that echoed through the trees. An hour into the work, voices approached from the main path. Ezra recognized Silas Pritchard's distinctive drawl immediately. The old master was walking with someone else, a neighboring planter named Townsend, judging by the accent. Ezra kept working, but angled himself closer to where their voices carried best. The other men did the same, all of them pretending total focus on their tasks while straining to hear. "Quite a creative solution to your financial troubles," Townsend was saying. His voice held amusement. "Though I must say, Silas, it's a bold move even for you." "Desperate times," Silas replied. "The girl was useless to me otherwise. No man of proper standing would have her. Too odd, too fat, too educated for her own good. And if she produces a child?" Ezra's hands tightened on his axe handle. "When she produces a child," Silas corrected, "that buck I chose is strong as an ox. Good bloodlines. The offspring should be valuable." Townsend laughed. "You plan to sell your own grandchild?" "Grandchild?" Silas's voice dripped with contempt. "Don't be absurd. The thing will be categorized as property, naturally. Mulatto stock. Should fetch a good price, especially if it's a boy." Strong build, trainable, young enough to mold properly. Your daughter knows this? My daughter knows what she needs to know, Silas said, which is that she serves the family interests. Always has. Always will. Townsend's laughter carried on the wind. You're a cold man, Silas Pritchard. I'm a practical man. There's a difference. Their voices faded as they walked on toward the main house. Ezra stood frozen, his axe halfway through a swing. The wood grain blurred in front of his eyes. He'd known Silas was cruel, had experienced that cruelty firsthand countless times. But this was something darker. This was planning out the sale of an unborn child to its mother's own father. This was treating human life like livestock futures. Magnolia didn't know. He was certain of it. She'd been terrified last night, yes, but she'd also held some small hope that her father's plan might be less monstrous than it appeared. That perhaps he truly did want an heir, however unconventionally conceived. But this erased any illusion. Silas wanted profit, nothing more. The day dragged on. Ezra worked mechanically, his mind racing through possibilities. Should he tell her? Would knowing make things worse? Could they protect a child that didn't even exist yet? By the time the sun started dropping toward the western trees, Ezra had made his decision. Magnolia deserved to know. She deserved to understand exactly what trap they were caught in. He returned to the cabin as dusk painted the sky purple. Magnolia was sitting outside on a stump she'd dragged near the door. She held a plate covered with cloth. "I made cornbread," she said. "It's not much, but I thought you might be hungry." Ezra took the plate. The cornbread was still warm, still soft, made with actual care instead of the hard, tasteless rations he usually received. "Thank you," he said. Then, "I need to tell you something." Magnolia looked up at him. "What is it?" "This morning, at the timber yard, your father was talking with another planter. I heard what they said." Ezra sat down on the cabin step. "About the child, the one he's expecting you to have." Magnolia went very still. "Tell me." Ezra repeated the conversation exactly as he'd heard it. He left nothing out. When he finished, Magnolia's face had gone pale in the fading light. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she stood up slowly, methodically. Her hands shook, but her voice came out steady. He would sell his own grandchild. Yes, he would put that child in bondage, would tear it from me and sell it like— She pressed both hands to her stomach. Like an animal. Yes. Magnolia turned away from him, her shoulders rigid. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. "I will not allow it. Miss Magnolia, I will not allow him to do this," she said again. "Not to you. Not to me. Not to any child that might exist." She turned back to face him. "Do you understand? I will die before I let him—" "You ain't gonna die," Ezra interrupted. He stood up, moved closer. "I won't let him hurt you. Won't let him hurt a child neither. I promise you that." Magnolia stared at him. "How can you promise such a thing? You have no power here. Neither of us do." "I got more power than you think," Ezra said quietly. "And we got each other now." That's something he didn't plan on. The last light drained from the sky. In the growing darkness, they looked at each other. Two people who'd been handed impossible circumstances and somehow found unexpected alliance. "There's a table inside," Ezra said. "Heavy one. I've been thinking we could move it to that corner. Make some space behind it." Magnolia's eyes narrowed. Space for what? Storage. Things we might need. Things it's better to keep hidden. Understanding crossed her face. "You're talking about planning. I'm talking about surviving." They went inside together. The table was oak, solid and scarred from years of use. Ezra took one end. Magnolia took the other. Together, they lifted and shifted it across the floor until it sat wedged into the corner exactly where Ezra had indicated. The space behind it was narrow but deep enough, hidden from casual view, perfect for what they'd need it for. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, catching dust motes in its pale beams. Magnolia stood at the rough-hewn table, a knife in her hand, and a pile of vegetables spread before her. Carrots, onions, a few potatoes she'd managed to take from the root cellar without anyone noticing. The knife made steady thumping sounds against the wood as she worked. Chop, 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 each piece falling into neat piles. Ezra knelt by the doorframe with a piece of sandpaper and a small chisel. The door had been hanging crooked since he'd moved in months ago. Nobody had bothered to fix it until now. The wood was old and warped, but he could make it better. Make it fit properly so the heat wouldn't seep in so easily. Birds sang outside, cheerful sounds that felt strange against everything else happening in their lives. "I have something to show you," Magnolia said, without looking up from her work. Ezra glanced over his shoulder. "What's that?" "Things I've been keeping from my father. For years now." She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "Wait here." She disappeared into the corner where she'd arranged her personal items. When she returned, she carried a cloth bag that clinked softly with each step. Magnolia set it on the table and began pulling things out. Small bags of grain tied with string, a leather-bound book, another book, smaller and more worn, a sewing kit, a small tin of salve, 3 candles wrapped in paper, a folding knife with a bone handle. Ezra stood slowly, moving to the table. His eyes widened as the pile grew. "How long you been hiding all this?" "Since I was 16, Magnolia said. "Maybe longer. I started small. A handful of grain here and there. A book from the library that Father never opened. Eventually, I got bolder." She touched the tin of salve. "This one I made myself from herbs in the garden. It helps with burns and cuts." Ezra picked up one of the books. The pages were yellowed but intact. "You took these from your father's house? He has hundreds of books he never reads. He wouldn't notice these missing if someone held them up to his face." Magnolia's voice carried a sharp edge. "I've been giving grain to the children in the quarters for 2 years. Small amounts they could hide. Enough to help, but not enough to be obvious. That's dangerous." "I know." She met his eyes. "But doing nothing felt more dangerous. To my soul. If nothing else." Ezra set the book down carefully. He'd never held one before. Never been this close to so many at once. The weight of them felt significant in a way he couldn't quite name. "There's more," Magnolia said. "But I need to be careful bringing it over. I don't want anyone noticing too much missing at once." "We'll make room for it," Ezra said. "Behind the table. Under the floorboards if we need to." They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Magnolia returned to her vegetables. Ezra went back to the doorframe. The summer heat built steadily, making the air thick and heavy. Around midday, Ezra stood and brushed wood dust from his hands. "I want to take you somewhere." Magnolia looked up. "Where?" "To meet some folks. Ones you've helped before, though you might not remember all their faces." Understanding crossed Magnolia's features. "The quarters?" "Just a few people. Good people. Ones who can be trusted." Ezra hesitated. "If you're willing." Magnolia set down her knife immediately. "I'm willing." They walked together across the property, following a worn path that led away from the main house. The sun beat down mercilessly. Magnolia's face flushed red from the heat, but she kept pace without complaint. The quarters consisted of small wooden cabins arranged in uneven rows. Chickens pecked at the dirt between them. A few children played with sticks in the shade. Ezra led Magnolia to one cabin in particular. He knocked twice on the frame before entering. Inside, an older woman sat mending a shirt. Her hair was completely gray, pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the twisted fingers that spoke of years of hard work. "Aunt Sarah," Ezra said. "This is Miss Magnolia. The one I told you about." Sarah set down her mending and stood slowly. Her eyes swept over Magnolia with careful assessment. Then, gradually, her face softened. You're the one been leaving grain for my grandbabies. Magnolia nodded. Yes, ma'am. Thought it was Ezra doing it at first. Then I realized the bags had a particular way of being tied. Neat, careful, like a woman's hands. Sarah moved closer. You take a big risk doing that. It felt right, Magnolia said simply. Sarah reached out and took Magnolia's hands in her own gnarled ones. You got a good heart, child, even if you're caught up in circumstances you didn't ask for. 2 more people entered the cabin. A young man named Thomas with a scar running down his left arm. A woman called Ruth, different from the house Ruth, who walked with a pronounced limp. They greeted Magnolia with careful warmth, cautious but genuine. Thomas showed her the scar on his arm. Got this from an overseer 3 years back. Caught me learning letters from a scrap of newspaper. He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Still can't move my thumb right. Ruth lifted her skirt slightly to reveal a twisted ankle. Mine's from running when I was young. Tried to escape. They caught me and broke it in 3 places. It healed wrong on purpose, so I'd never run again. Magnolia listened to each story. Her face grew paler with each revelation. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. These were real people with real scars carried on bodies that had been treated like property their entire lives. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Ain't your fault, Sarah said firmly. You didn't make this world. You just got born into it, same as us. Different circumstances, but trapped all the same. They talked for nearly an hour. Magnolia asked questions, listened carefully to the answers, learned things about the plantation she'd lived on her entire life, but never truly seen. When they finally left, Ezra walked beside Magnolia in silence until they were well away from the quarters. Thank you for taking me there, Magnolia said. I needed to see that, to understand better. There's more you need to know, Ezra said. Practical things, things that might keep us alive if we're smart about it. Over the following days, Ezra taught Magnolia how to move quietly through the property after dark, how to avoid the spots where floorboards creaked, how to read the moods of the overseers by their walking patterns, how to lie convincingly when questioned, keeping her face neutral, her voice steady, offering just enough truth to make the deception believable. Magnolia proved to be a surprisingly quick learner. In return, she taught Ezra to read. They sat at the table together after dinner each evening, a single candle burning between them. Magnolia would write letters on scraps of cloth or paper, pronouncing each one clearly. Ezra would repeat them, his deep voice wrapping around sounds he'd never been allowed to make before. A, Magnolia said, pointing to the letter. A, Ezra repeated. B, B. The alphabet came slowly, but steadily. Magnolia was patient in a way Ezra had never experienced from someone in authority. She never scolded when he struggled, never showed frustration when he needed something repeated. A fragile friendship began forming between them, built on necessity at first, but growing into something more genuine with each passing day. Ezra found himself thinking about things he'd buried years ago, dreams of freedom he'd crushed down because hoping hurt too much. But now, with Magnolia's quiet rebellion showing him that white people could resist the system from within, those old dreams started stirring again. Maybe escape wasn't impossible. Maybe, with planning and help, they could find a way north. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. One evening, after their reading lesson, Magnolia took a fresh scrap of cloth and carefully wrote out the entire alphabet. Her handwriting was neat and clear. "Practice with this," she said, handing it to Ezra. "Trace the letters with your finger until you can see them with your eyes closed." Ezra took the cloth carefully, held it like the precious thing it was. Magnolia yawned and stood up. "I'm tired. I think I'll sleep now. Good night, Miss Magnolia." "Just Magnolia," she said. "Please." She settled onto her cot in the corner. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Ezra remained at the table, the candle burning low beside him. He traced each letter with his fingertip. A, B, C, D. The shapes felt foreign and familiar at the same time. The candle wax pooled at the base, forming uneven shapes. Ezra didn't move to get another. He worked by the fading light, committing each letter to memory through touch alone. 5 days later, Magnolia woke to sounds outside the cabin. She sat up slowly, her body still heavy with sleep. Through the small window, she could see Ezra crouched near the edge of the clearing, his hands moving carefully through the undergrowth. She dressed and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and damp. Dew covered everything in a thin layer of moisture that caught the early light. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ezra looked up. He held several leafy stems in his hands. "Gathering herbs, wild ginger and mullein. They grow in the shade here." "For what purpose? You said you have trouble sometime. With pain. From your condition." Ezra's voice was matter-of-fact, but gentle. "These can help. My mother knew how to prepare them. She taught me before she was sold." Magnolia felt something tighten in her chest. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Ezra stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "But it seemed useful, just in case." She watched him carry the herbs inside and lay them carefully on the table. His movements were precise and deliberate, nothing wasted. Over the following days, Magnolia began moving more freely among the quarters. At first, her presence drew wary looks and careful silence. She was Silas Pritchard's daughter, after all. Trust didn't come easily, but she kept returning. She brought bread wrapped in cloth, shared it quietly with whoever would accept, helped wash clothes at the communal area, her soft hands quickly developing blisters that she didn't complain about. She read to the children in the evenings, using simple stories and teaching them letters when no one was watching. Sarah watched her carefully during those first visits, testing her sincerity through observation. "You don't have to keep coming here," Sarah said one afternoon. "Might be safer if you didn't." "I want to come," Magnolia replied. "If I'm allowed." "Allowed?" Sarah snorted softly. "Strange word coming from you. Usually we're the ones asking permission for everything." Magnolia's face colored with shame. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant, child." Sarah's expression softened. "You're trying. That counts for something." Thomas began showing Magnolia how to mend clothing properly, how to make the stitches small and tight so they'd hold under hard labor. Ruth taught her how to recognize which wild plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick. They were teaching her survival skills, things she'd never needed to know in the big house. Meanwhile, Ezra worked on something else entirely. He began quietly redirecting supplies, small amounts of dried meat that wouldn't be missed, tools that could be explained away as lost or broken, rope, flint, a water skin that had been discarded for a small tear he could easily repair. He stored everything in a hidden compartment they'd built together beneath the cabin floor. The boards lifted smoothly if you knew where to press. The space beneath was dry and dark, perfect for concealing things. One evening, Magnolia came to Ezra with a proposal. "I've been thinking," she said. "My father will eventually expect evidence. That his plan is working." Ezra understood immediately. "The pregnancy he's waiting for." "Yes." Magnolia's voice was steady despite the subject matter. "I could fake early signs. Morning sickness can be imitated easily enough. A little paleness, some carefully timed complaints about feeling unwell. That buys us time," Ezra said thoughtfully. "He'll be patient if he thinks it's happening." "Exactly. Maybe several months before he grows suspicious." They agreed on the deception. It felt strange planning such a thing, but necessity made strange allies of them both. As days passed, something subtle began shifting between them. Small moments of affection that neither acknowledged directly, but both noticed. Ezra would save the best portion of their shared meals for Magnolia without comment. She would mend his work shirts with careful attention to detail, reinforcing the seams that took the most stress. When she struggled with heavy lifting, He'd appear beside her without being asked. When he worked late into the night on their escape preparations, she'd sit nearby with quiet company. One afternoon, while helping Ruth hang laundry, Magnolia smiled. Actually smiled. The expression felt foreign on her face after years of learned misery, but it came naturally in that moment. Ruth noticed. "Haven't seen you look like that before." "Like what?" "Happy. Even a little bit." Magnolia touched her own face, surprised. "I suppose I am. Strange, isn't it? Given everything." "Not so strange," Ruth said. "Sometimes the worst circumstances bring out the best kinds of hope. When you got nothing else to lose, hope becomes dangerous, powerful." Around Magnolia, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of safety. Not complete safety, that was impossible in their situation, but a feeling that someone genuinely cared whether he lived or died, whether he suffered or found peace. It changed something fundamental in how he moved through the world. 3 weeks after they'd begun planning in earnest, Magnolia approached Ezra with barely contained excitement. "I found something," she said. "In my mother's old trunk. The one my father never bothered going through after she died." She pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. When she spread it flat on the table, Ezra saw lines and markings he didn't fully understand yet. "It's a map," Magnolia explained. "Routes north. My mother's family came from Pennsylvania. She must have kept this from when she traveled south to marry my father. Look, these marks here show rivers. These are towns. And these," she pointed to small X's along certain paths. "I think these might be safe houses, places that would help." Ezra studied the map intensely. His reading skills were still developing, but he could make out some of the place names, could trace the lines northward with his finger, could imagine, for the first time, an actual route to freedom. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "We could really do it," Magnolia whispered. "Not just you and whoever you chose to take, but me too. I could come with you." Ezra looked at her, really looked at her, saw determination in her face that hadn't been there weeks ago, saw strength built from quiet rebellion and genuine conviction. "You understand what you'd be leaving behind?" he asked. "I understand what I'd be escaping from," she corrected. "There's a difference." They spent hours studying the map together, planning routes, estimating distances, discussing what supplies they'd need and how much time to wait before attempting the journey. That night, after their usual reading practice, they sat in comfortable silence. The candle burned between them, casting wavering shadows on the walls. Ezra spoke first. "We might really live free one day." Magnolia's response came as a whisper, but carried the weight of a vow. "Together!" The candle flame flickered once, twice, then extinguished. The next morning, Overseer Harlan stood in the shadow of a persimmon tree, watching. He'd been watching for days now, ever since he'd noticed the changes. Harlan was a man built from jealousy and spite. In his mid-30s, with a narrow face and eyes that never seemed to blink enough, he'd risen from poverty to his current position through cruelty and opportunism. He hated Ezra for being stronger, hated Magnolia for being softer than her father, hated that they seemed to exist in some private understanding he couldn't penetrate or control. The cabin door opened. Magnolia stepped out carrying a cloth bundle. Even from this distance, Harlan could see it was food. Bread, maybe. Dried fruit. Things from her own ration. She walked toward the quarters with purpose. Harlan followed. He moved through the trees at the edge of the clearing, keeping low and quiet. Years of hunting runaway slaves had taught him how to track without being noticed, how to use shadows, how to breathe shallowly, so no one heard him coming. Magnolia reached the quarters and found a group of children playing near one of the cabins. They looked up at her approach. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and careful trust. She knelt down in the dirt, her dress pooling around her, opened the cloth bundle, passed out pieces of cornbread, One child, a girl maybe 6 years old, stayed close to Magnolia's side. The girl had a healing bruise on her arm. Magnolia touched it gently, examining it with concern. Then Magnolia reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A book, worn and thin, but unmistakably a book. Harlan's jaw tightened. She was reading to them, teaching them, right there in broad daylight where anyone could see. The girl leaned against Magnolia's shoulder while she read. The other children gathered closer, listening to words they weren't supposed to know. Words that would get them beaten if the wrong person found out. Harlan committed every detail to memory. Evidence. Proof of insubordination. He slipped away before anyone noticed him. Later that afternoon, Harlan positioned himself near the woodshed, where he could observe the cabin without being obvious about it. He pretended to inspect tools, to check inventory, just doing his job. The sun was lowering in the sky when he saw them. Ezra and Magnolia stood in the cabin doorway, close but not touching. Ezra's head was bent down toward Magnolia's, listening intently to something she was saying. She gestured with her hands, explaining something. He nodded, asked a question. She answered. Their body language spoke of familiarity, mutual respect, partnership. It made Harlan's skin crawl. A slave shouldn't stand that way with a white woman, shouldn't speak that freely, shouldn't look at her like an equal. And Magnolia, she shouldn't allow it, shouldn't encourage it, shouldn't smile at him like she was smiling now. Harlan watched them whisper together for several minutes before they both went back inside the cabin. The door closed. He waited until full dark. Then he made his move. The cabin had no lock. Slaves didn't get locks. Harlan pushed the door open and stepped inside. An oil lamp sat cold on the table. He lit it with a match from his pocket. The flame cast dancing shadows across the small space. He searched methodically. Started with the obvious places first. Under the thin mattresses, behind the few pieces of furniture, in the corners where things might be stuffed and forgotten. Nothing immediately suspicious. He opened the small trunk at the foot of Magnolia's cot, found her clothes, neatly folded, a few personal items, a hairbrush, ribbon. Nothing incriminating. Ezra's possessions were even more sparse. A single change of clothes, a eating knife, a carved wooden figure, looked like a bird, probably something he'd made himself. Harlan moved to the table, rifled through the few items on its surface. A bowl, spoons, a cloth for cleaning. Then he found it, tucked between the pages of a small Bible. The kind handed out to slaves for approved Sunday services was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, folded carefully. Harlan spread it open. A map, clear as day, with routes marked northward, towns labeled, rivers traced, and small X's along certain paths that could only mean one thing: safe houses, underground railroad stops, escape routes. Harlan's heart pounded with vindictive excitement. This was better than he'd hoped. Concrete evidence of conspiracy, of planned escape, of betrayal. He folded the map and slipped it inside his shirt. He didn't find the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Didn't think to press on the boards in the specific pattern that would reveal the hollow space. Didn't discover the supplies Ezra had been stockpiling. But the map was enough. More than enough. He left the cabin exactly as he'd found it, taking only the one piece of evidence. Let the door swing shut behind him. Disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Harlan stood in Silas Pritchard's study with the map in his hand. "Found this in the slave cabin, Master Pritchard. The one where your daughter's been staying." Silas took the map, studied it. His face went from confusion to understanding to rage in the span of seconds. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Hidden in a Bible. But that ain't all, sir." Harlan leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was sharing dangerous secrets. "I seen Miss Magnolia carrying food to the quarters, teaching slave children to read, right out in the open, showing them books, treating them like they was people." Silas's hand crumpled the edge of the map. And the boy, Ezra, he's been acting peculiar, standing too close to your daughter, speaking to her too familiar, moving around the property like he owns it, like he ain't property himself. Harlan paused for effect. I believe they're conspiring together, sir. Planning something. Something that disrespects your authority and your household. Conspiring, Silas repeated. The word came out like poison. Yes, sir. I wouldn't bring this to your attention if I wasn't certain, but I seen it with my own eyes, multiple times. They're plotting something, and that map proves it. Silas stood up abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor. He paced to the window, looked out at his decaying plantation, then spun back toward Harlan. My daughter has humiliated me, he said. His voice shook with fury. Given herself over to slave sympathy. Made a mockery of my generosity and my name. Yes, sir. And that boy, that ungrateful, insolent boy, has taken advantage, has forgotten his place, has dared to imagine himself worthy of plans and freedom. Yes, sir. That's exactly right. Silas's face flushed deep red. Veins stood out on his forehead. He grabbed the edge of his desk like he needed it for support. They need to be reminded, he said. Both of them, but especially him. He needs to understand what happens when property forgets what it is. I agree completely, Master Pritchard. Silas stormed past Harlan, throwing the study door open so hard it crashed against the wall. He strode into the hallway, bellowing orders. Get me the whip, the heavy one. Servants scattered. A housemaid gasped and pressed herself against the wall. Silas turned back to Harlan, his eyes wild with betrayed rage. Prepare that boy for punishment at dawn. I want everyone to see. I want my daughter to watch what happens when she betrays her own blood for the sake of slaves. Harlan smiled. Yes, sir. I'll see to it personally. That evening, Ezra walked back toward the cabin with Magnolia beside him. The sun had dropped below the tree line. Long shadows stretched across the plantation grounds like fingers reaching toward them. Something felt wrong. Ezra noticed it first. The way the overseers positioned themselves along the path. Not working, not occupied with evening tasks, just watching, standing with arms crossed, eyes tracking every movement. 3 men near the barn, 2 more by the equipment shed. Harlan himself leaning against a fence post, picking his teeth with a piece of straw. All of them staring. Magnolia noticed it too. Her breathing changed, became shallow and quick. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the evening was still warm. Something's happened, she whispered. Ezra didn't respond. Couldn't risk it. Not with so many eyes on them. They reached the cabin. Ezra opened the door and stood aside to let Magnolia enter first. He followed, closing the door behind them. Inside, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Magnolia's hands shook as she lit the oil lamp. The match trembled between her fingers. It took 3 tries before the flame caught and steadied. Ezra moved to the table, looked at the items on its surface. The Bible sat where it always did, but something about its placement seemed different. Shifted slightly, disturbed. He opened it carefully. The map was gone. His stomach dropped. Cold dread flooded through him. What is it? Magnolia asked. She came to stand beside him, looking at the empty pages. The map, Ezra said quietly. Someone took it. Magnolia's face went pale. When? How? They searched the cabin. While we were out. Ezra's jaw tightened. They know. Oh, God. Magnolia pressed her hand to her mouth. My father. You need to go to him. Now. Before he comes here. Ezra turned to face her. Deny everything. Tell him you had no knowledge of any map. Tell him I must have stolen it. Put all blame on me. I won't do that. You have to. It's the only way to protect yourself. I don't care about protecting myself. Magnolia's voice rose. Ezra, if he knows about the map, if he knows we've been planning... A shout from outside cut her off. Ezra moved to the window. Through the thin curtain he could see men gathering, torches being lit, the orange glow growing brighter. "Stay here," he told Magnolia. "Lock the door after I leave." "What? No, you can't go out there." "I have to. If I run, they'll hurt everyone in the quarters looking for me. If I hide, they'll tear this place apart and find you too." Ezra gripped her shoulders. "Stay inside, no matter what happens. Do you understand?" Tears filled Magnolia's eyes. "Please don't go." But he was already moving toward the door. Magnolia ran after him. "I'm going to my father. I'll make him listen. I'll tell him this was all my fault." "That won't help." "It might." Ezra looked at her one last time, saw the determination in her face, the desperate hope that somehow she could stop what was coming. He knew she couldn't, but he nodded anyway. They left the cabin together, walking in opposite directions. Ezra toward the gathering men and torchlight. Magnolia toward the big house. Magnolia ran up the wide front steps, burst through the door without knocking. Her father's housemaid jumped back in surprise. "Where is he?" Magnolia demanded. "Miss Magnolia, you shouldn't be—" "Where is my father?" The maid pointed toward the hallway leading to his study. Magnolia ran. Her boots pounded against the wooden floor. She reached the study and threw the door open. Silas stood by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned slowly to face her. "You," he said. The word dripped with contempt. "Father, please." "Whatever you've heard, whatever they've told you, they told me the truth." Silas set his glass down with deliberate care. "They told me my own daughter has become a traitor to her blood and her class. That's not true. You've been teaching slaves to read, feeding them from your own table, treating them like equals." Silas's voice grew louder with each accusation. "And that boy, that property I so generously allowed you to share space with, you've been conspiring with him, planning to run north, planning to steal from me." "No, I never— Don't lie to me!" Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. His hand came up fast. The slap caught Magnolia across the face with enough force to knock her sideways. She stumbled against the door frame, tasting blood. "You have disgraced this family," Silas said. His voice had gone cold, controlled, more frightening than his shouting. "You have made a mockery of my charity. You have sided with animals over your own father." Magnolia pressed her hand to her burning cheek. "He's not an animal. None of them are. Get out of my sight." "Father, please." "Harlan," Silas bellowed. "Get in here." The overseer appeared almost instantly. He must have been waiting just outside the door. "Take my daughter to her old room," Silas ordered. "Lock her in. She's to stay there until I decide what to do with her." "No!" Magnolia tried to push past Harlan, but he grabbed her arm. His grip was brutal. "Let me go. You can't—" "I can do whatever I please under my own roof." Silas turned away from her. "Take her. Now." Harlan dragged Magnolia down the hallway. She fought him, kicked and twisted and clawed. But he was stronger. He threw her into the small bedroom she'd occupied as a child. She stumbled and fell, heard the key turn in the lock before she could reach the door. "Let me out!" She pounded on the wood with both fists. "Father, please!" No response. Meanwhile, outside near the barns, Ezra stood surrounded by 6 armed men. He didn't fight, didn't run, just stood with his hands at his sides while they chained him. Heavy iron shackles clamped around his wrists, around his ankles. The metal bit into his skin. They dragged him to the whipping post, a thick wooden beam set deep in the ground, used for exactly this purpose. Ezra had seen other men tied there, had heard their screams carry across the plantation. Now it was his turn. They forced his arms up, chained his wrists to the iron rings bolted into the post. His shoulders immediately began to ache from the unnatural position. Harlan circled him slowly. "You thought you were special, didn't you? Thought the master's generosity made you different from the others? Ezra said nothing. Tomorrow morning, everyone's going to watch you remember what you really are. Harlan leaned close. Property. Nothing more. The overseers left torches burning in brackets nearby. Enough light to make sure Ezra couldn't slip away in darkness. Then they dispersed, leaving only 2 guards posted at a distance. Ezra stood chained, arms stretched painfully above his head, the metal cutting into his wrists. Fear tasted like metal in his mouth. Back in the big house, Magnolia threw her body against the locked door repeatedly. The wood was solid, old, built to last. She screamed until her voice went hoarse. Then she looked around the room for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the heavy vanity chair, the one she'd sat in as a girl while her mother brushed her hair. Magnolia grabbed it, swung it with all her strength at the door. The impact jarred her arms. The chair's legs splintered but held. She swung again, and again, and again. On the 5th strike, part of the lock mechanism cracked. The wood around it began to split. But not enough. Not yet. Magnolia collapsed to the floor beside the splintered doorway, gasping for breath. Tears streamed down her face. In the enslaved quarters, whispers spread like wildfire. They'd taken Ezra, chained him to the post. Master Pritchard was planning something terrible for Dawn. The community gathered in the largest cabin, spoke in hushed, urgent tones. "Can't let this happen," someone said. "He protected us, helped us. We owe him. Miss Magnolia, too. She's been good to our children. Master's gone too far this time." They began to plan. Quiet preparation. Gathering what little they had. Making decisions that could cost them everything. The moon climbed higher in the dark sky. Ezra stood chained to the post, muscles cramping, wrists bleeding where the iron rubbed raw. Magnolia lay on the floor of her locked room, still trying to break free. Splinters embedded in her palms from swinging the chair, and dawn crept closer with every passing minute. The first gray light of dawn crept through the narrow window of Magnolia's childhood bedroom. She lay on the floor beside the damaged door, her body stiff and aching from the night spent trying to break free. Her palms were raw, splinters embedded deep in the flesh. Her shoulders throbbed from swinging the heavy chair again and again until exhaustion finally claimed her. But something had changed overnight. The door frame had shifted. The wood around the lock mechanism had cracked further from the stress. One of the screws holding the strike plate in place had worked itself loose, creating a tiny gap between the door and the frame. Magnolia pushed herself to sitting. Every muscle protested. Her head pounded. The side of her face, where her father had struck her, felt swollen and tender. She crawled to the door on her hands and knees, examined the gap with her fingers. The screw head was visible now, partially exposed, her hairpin. The long metal pin she'd used to keep her hair in place yesterday still sat on the floor near the vanity where she'd dropped it during her frantic attempts to escape. Magnolia grabbed it with trembling fingers, wedged the pointed end into the groove of the screw head, twisted. The metal bent slightly under the pressure, but the screw turned, just a fraction. She twisted harder. The pin bit into her palm, drew blood. The screw turned again, and again. 5 minutes of agonizing work. 10, 15. The screw finally came loose enough to pull free with her fingers. Magnolia threw it aside, put her shoulder against the door, and pushed with everything she had left. The damaged lock gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung open. Magnolia stumbled into the hallway, caught herself against the wall. Her vision swam. She was dizzy, bruised, exhausted. But Ezra needed her. She limped toward the staircase. Each step sent pain shooting through her body. The fall yesterday had left her battered. The night of struggling had drained whatever strength remained. She gripped the banister with both hands, made her way down one step at a time. The big house was silent. Dawn had not yet fully broken. The servants were not yet awake. Magnolia reached the bottom of the stairs, crossed the entrance hall, pushed open the front door. Outside, the plantation yard was bathed in pre-dawn gray light. Everything looked washed out, colorless. Near the barns, torches still burned in their brackets. Their orange glow was fading as natural light began to take over. Ezra stood chained to the whipping post. His head hung forward, arms stretched painfully above him. Even from a distance, Magnolia could see the dark stains on his wrists, where the iron had cut into skin. Men were gathering, overseers and field hands forced to witness. The enslaved community assembled in a loose semicircle around the post, but something was different about their positioning. They weren't clustered together the way people normally stood when forced to watch punishment. They were spread out, strategically placed. Some held tools, others carried buckets or bundles of rags. All of them wore the blank expressions of people pretending to prepare for morning tasks. But their eyes were alert, watching, waiting. Magnolia stumbled forward. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She pressed one hand to her ribs and kept moving. Harlan stood near the whipping post with a long leather whip coiled in his hand. He was speaking to Ezra. Magnolia couldn't hear the words, but she could see the cruel satisfaction on the overseer's face. Her father emerged from the main house behind her. Silas descended the porch steps with measured dignity, dressed for the day as if this were any normal morning. He saw Magnolia crossing the yard. His expression darkened. "Get back inside," he commanded. Magnolia ignored him, kept walking. "I said, get inside, now!" She didn't stop, didn't look back, just focused on reaching Ezra before the whip fell. Harlan uncoiled the whip with a practiced flick of his wrist. The leather cracked against the ground. A warning, a promise of what was coming. He positioned himself behind Ezra, raised his arm high. "Stop!" Magnolia's voice came out hoarse, broken, but loud enough to carry across the yard. "Stop this right now!" Harlan paused, looked to Silas for instruction. Magnolia staggered forward, placed herself between Harlan and Ezra's exposed back. Her body swayed, her vision blurred, but she stood firm. "Move," Harlan said. "No." Ezra lifted his head. His eyes found hers. "Magnolia, don't. I won't let him hurt you." "This is foolishness," Silas called out. He strode across the yard toward them. "Harlan, remove her." The overseer reached for Magnolia's arm. She jerked away. "Touch me and I'll—" "You'll what?" Silas's voice was ice. He stood just a few feet away now. "You have no power here, no authority. You are nothing but a disappointment who has forgotten her place." "I haven't forgotten anything," Magnolia said. Her legs trembled. She locked her knees to keep from falling. "I finally see clearly. I see what you are, what this place is, what you've done to all of these people." "Strike her," Silas said to Harlan. Magnolia's eyes went wide. "What?" "You heard me. Strike her. Teach her obedience." Harlan hesitated. "Sir, she's your—" "Strike her. That's an order." The overseer's face twisted with something between pleasure and uncertainty. He raised the whip. "Father, please!" The leather whistled through the air. Pain exploded across Magnolia's shoulder. The whip caught her just below the collarbone, tore through the fabric of her dress, split skin. She cried out, stumbled, nearly fell. Behind her, Ezra roared. The sound was primal, inhuman, pure fury given voice. He threw his full weight against the chains. The iron links strained. One of them, weakened from age and rust, began to give. Harlan had assumed the restraints were secure, had checked them quickly in the dark, missed the corroded section of chain between Ezra's left wrist and the post ring. Ezra pulled again, muscles bulging, tendons standing out like cables under his skin. The weakened link snapped. His left arm came free. Ezra twisted, grabbed the chain still attached to his right wrist with his freed hand. Used it like a weapon. Harlan turned just in time to see the iron chain swinging toward his face. The metal connected with brutal force. Harlan went down hard. Blood sprayed from his broken nose. Around the yard, the enslaved community surged forward as one. Tools became weapons, rakes, shovels, hammers, everything they'd been carrying as props for their pretend morning work. The two guards posted near the post rushed toward Ezra, but they were intercepted by field hands who'd positioned themselves perfectly for exactly this moment. Chaos erupted across the plantation yard. Coordinated, planned, unstoppable. The revolt spread like wildfire across the plantation yard. Ezra stood over Harlan's fallen body, the broken chain still gripped in his freed hand. Blood dripped from the overseer's shattered nose. The man groaned and tried to push himself upright. Two field hands, Samuel and Isaiah, stepped forward. They carried coils of rope they'd been pretending to organize near the barn. Within seconds, they had Harlan's wrists bound behind his back, tight enough to restrain, not tight enough to cut off circulation. "Don't kill him," Ezra said. His voice was steady, despite the fury burning in his chest. "Just keep him down." Samuel nodded. He and Isaiah dragged Harlan toward the barn wall and secured him there with additional rope around his torso. The overseer's eyes were wild with fear and rage, but he couldn't move. Magnolia clung to Ezra's arm. Her shoulder burned where the whip had caught her. Blood soaked through the torn fabric of her dress. She felt dizzy, unsteady, but she wouldn't let go. Around the yard, the coordinated uprising continued with practiced precision. The two guards who'd rushed toward Ezra were now pinned against the fence by 4 men wielding wooden handles and iron tools. One guard dropped his weapon immediately. The other tried to fight and received a sharp blow to the ribs that doubled him over. "Hold them!" called out a woman named Ruth. She was older than most, gray-haired, strong. "Don't kill, just hold." More rope appeared. The guards were bound and seated on the ground with their backs to the fence posts, secured but unharmed. Near the main house, 3 house servants had intercepted the cook and the laundress, both white women who'd worked for Silas for years. The servants held them gently but firmly, spoke in quiet tones, explained that no one would be hurt if they stayed calm. The cook was crying. The laundress looked too shocked to speak. Everything was happening with terrifying speed and organization. This wasn't chaos. This was months of quiet planning finally executed. Ezra scanned the yard, counted the people, made sure everyone was accounted for. Then he saw movement near the stables. Silas. The master had retreated while everyone else focused on the initial confrontation. He was leading his fastest horse from the stable. Already had 1 foot in the stirrup. "He's running!" someone shouted. Ezra released Magnolia carefully, placed her hand against the whipping post so she could steady herself. Then he sprinted toward the stables. His legs burned, his wrists bled where the iron had cut him, but he ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. Silas swung himself into the saddle, kicked his heels into the horse's flanks. The animal bolted forward. But 2 young men, brothers named Jacob and Thomas, had positioned themselves near the gate with a wagon loaded with hay bales. As soon as they saw Silas mounting, they shoved the wagon directly into his path. The horse reared. Silas yanked the reins hard, tried to turn the animal. Ezra reached them, grabbed the horse's bridle, pulled down with all his strength. The horse steadied, stopped fighting. Silas looked down at Ezra with pure hatred. "You dare!" Ezra yanked the older man from the saddle. Silas hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He gasped, rolled onto his side. Ezra stood over him. Every muscle in his body screamed for violence, for retribution, for all the years of pain and humiliation and loss. But he waited. Magnolia limped across the yard toward them. Her face was pale. Her dress was torn and bloodied. She moved like someone fighting against their own body's limits, but she kept coming. The enslaved community formed a loose circle around the scene, silent, watching. Magnolia reached them, stood beside Ezra, looked down at her father, sprawled in the dirt. Silas struggled to his feet. His fine clothes were covered in dust. His face was red with exertion and rage. "Magnolia," he said. His voice shook. "Stop this madness. Tell them to stand down. You are still my daughter. You still have a duty." "No." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I have no duty to you anymore." Silas's expression shifted, from anger to something closer to fear. "You don't understand what you're doing. What this means. They'll hang you for this. Hang all of you. You're destroying everything." "You destroyed everything," Magnolia said. "You destroyed yourself. You destroyed this family. You tried to destroy me and Ezra and everyone here. I gave you everything. A home, education, security. You gave me nothing but pain." Magnolia's hands trembled. She pressed them together to stop the shaking. "You hurt me every day of my life. Made me feel small, worthless. You tried to use me like property, like I was nothing more than another tool for your greed." Silas looked at the circle of people surrounding them, at the bound overseers, at the servants holding the household staff, at his daughter standing beside the enslaved man he'd tried to destroy. His world was ending. The comprehension settled across his face like a death mask. "Magnolia." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Please." She turned to Ezra. "What happens now?" Ezra met her eyes. He could see the question beneath the question. The choice she was offering herself. The weight of it. "That's for you to decide," he said quietly. "He's your blood, not mine." Magnolia looked back at her father, studied his face, saw nothing there she recognized anymore. No love, no remorse, just fear and calculation. Even now, even with everything collapsing around him, he was looking for an angle, a way to manipulate, to survive, to rebuild his power. She thought of all the children he'd sold away from their mothers, all the families he'd torn apart, all the bodies broken under whips and chains, all the lives crushed beneath his need for control. She thought of the child he'd planned to sell. Her child, a baby not yet conceived, but already condemned to slavery in his mind. "I don't recognize you as my father anymore," Magnolia said. Her voice was steady now, clear. "Your legacy ends here, today, with me." She stepped back, stood beside Ezra. The crowd shifted, closed in slightly. Silas looked around wildly. "Wait! Wait! Please!" What happened next was quick, final, conducted with the same coordinated precision as everything else that morning. The enslaved community moved as one, not with chaos or cruelty, with purpose. Silas Pritchard did not survive. When it was finished, the yard fell silent. The sun had fully risen now. Golden light spread across the plantation, illuminated everything with brutal clarity. People stood breathing hard. Some were crying. Others looked numb, shell-shocked by what they'd done, by what they'd finally become. Free. But freedom came with terror, with the knowledge that the law would call this murder, rebellion, that riders would come eventually, that the whole weight of the South's rage would fall on them if they stayed. "We move now," Ezra said. His voice cut through the silence. "Everyone grab what you can carry. Food, clothes, tools. We have maybe a day before anyone comes looking." The community scattered, moving with purpose, born of months of quiet preparation. Ruth organized the women and children. Samuel and Isaiah gathered the men. They'd planned routes, identified supplies, known this moment might come. Ezra turned to Magnolia. She was swaying on her feet. Her shoulders still bled. Her face was ashen with pain and shock. "Come on," he said gently. He guided her toward a wagon near the barn. Someone had already lined it with blankets and quilts, made it soft. Ezra lifted Magnolia carefully and placed her in the wagon bed. She winced, but didn't cry out. "Rest," he said. "We'll move soon." Magnolia nodded, lay back against the blankets, closed her eyes. Around them, the plantation prepared for exodus, for the journey north, for whatever came next. The group left before the sun fully rose. 23 people in total. Men, women, children. Some riding in wagons, others walking, all carrying what they could. Bundles of clothes, bags of food, tools wrapped in cloth. Ezra walked beside the lead wagon. Magnolia lay in the bed, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the summer heat. Her shoulder was bandaged with strips torn from a bedsheet. Ruth had cleaned and dressed the wound before they departed. Applied a poultice of herbs to prevent infection. Magnolia's face was pale. She drifted in and out of sleep as the wagon rolled forward over uneven ground. Ezra kept one hand on the wagon's edge, watched her breathing, made sure she stayed warm and still. They followed the map Magnolia's mother had left behind, a delicate piece of paper that showed routes through forests and along lesser-known paths, roads that avoided major towns, trails that crossed streams at shallow points, places where travelers could move without being seen. The first day was the hardest. Everyone moved quickly. Fear drove them forward. Fear of being followed, of being caught, of facing the consequences of what they'd done. Children cried from exhaustion. Adults pushed through pain and hunger. The wagons creaked under their loads. Horses tired quickly on the rough terrain. They stopped only twice, once at midday to water the animals and eat dried meat and cornbread, once at dusk to make a cold camp in a dense grove of trees. No fires, no singing, no loud voices. People huddled together under blankets, whispered prayers, held their children close. Ezra sat beside Magnolia's wagon through the night, watched the darkness for movement, listened for the sound of riders or dogs. Nothing came. The second day brought rain, a steady drizzle that soaked through clothes and turned the paths to mud. The wagons struggled. Wheels sank into soft ground. Horses strained against the weight. Twice they had to stop and push. Everyone capable put their hands to the wagon beds, shoved until the wheels broke free and rolled forward again. Magnolia woke during one of these stops, tried to climb down and help. Ezra gently pushed her back. "Stay still. You'll tear your stitches." "I can help." "You help by staying alive," he said firmly. "Rest." She lay back, tears mixed with rain on her face. She hated feeling useless, hated being a burden, but she obeyed. The third day was clearer, cooler. The group made better time. They passed through a stretch of forest so thick the canopy blocked out the sun, traveled in green-filtered twilight. Birds called overhead. Squirrels chattered in the branches. Some of the children began to relax, walked instead of riding, pointed at interesting trees and flowers. Ruth started humming quietly, a low melody. Others joined in. Nothing loud enough to carry far, just enough to ease the tension. By the fourth day, they reached the first safe town marked on Magnolia's map. It was small, barely 50 buildings, mostly wooden structures clustered around a crossroads, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a crooked steeple, the kind of place that asked few questions. Ezra went in first, alone, walked into the general store and asked the owner about work in the area, lodging, whether travelers were welcome. The owner, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, studied Ezra carefully, took in his build, his scars, the careful way he spoke. "You running from something?" the owner asked. "Looking for something," Ezra replied. "Peace, work, a place to settle." The man nodded slowly. "We get folks like you sometimes, folks looking to start over. Long as you cause no trouble, you're welcome to try." He directed Ezra to a woman named Mrs. Brennan, who ran a boarding house at the edge of town. Said she was sympathetic to travelers, discreet. Ezra thanked him and left. Mrs. Brennan turned out to be an older white woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile. She listened to Ezra's carefully crafted story, that he was traveling with his employer, a widow named Magnolia Pritchard, and several other freed people seeking work. Mrs. Brennan asked no further questions, offered them 3 rooms at reasonable rates, pointed them toward a Quaker meeting house 2 streets over, where they might find additional help. The Quakers were abolitionists, quiet ones. They provided clothing, food, and, most importantly, connections. An older Quaker man named Samuel Garrett helped Magnolia draft the documents she needed. A false affidavit claiming widowhood, papers stating she'd inherited her late husband's modest estate, a contract hiring Ezra as a farmhand with wages and housing included. The forgery was careful, convincing, designed to protect Ezra in a world that viewed free black men with suspicion and hostility. Magnolia signed the papers with a steady hand. Her shoulder was healing. The fever had broken on the 5th day of travel. She could sit upright now, walk short distances without help. "This makes you legally free," she told Ezra quietly, as they reviewed the documents together. "But it's not real freedom, not the kind you deserve." "It's more than I had yesterday," Ezra said. "That's enough for now." With the documents secured, they began searching for permanent housing. The town had several abandoned properties, homesteads left behind by families who'd moved west or died out. Most were in poor condition, roofs sagging, walls rotting, gardens overgrown. Ezra and Magnolia found a small cottage at the northern edge of town. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a well in the yard, an acre of land suitable for planting. The previous owner had died without heirs. The property had reverted to the town. The mayor sold it to Magnolia for a modest sum, money she'd taken from her father's safe before leaving the plantation. They moved in on a cool morning in late summer. The cottage needed work. Ezra spent weeks repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, fixing the door frames. He built a small barn for chickens and a goat they purchased from a neighboring farm. Magnolia set up a sewing corner near the window, began taking in mending work from townspeople. She also started teaching reading lessons to children whose families couldn't afford formal schooling. The other members of their group dispersed throughout the area. Some found work on nearby farms. Others apprenticed with tradesmen. A few moved on to larger cities further north. But they stayed connected, met weekly at the Quaker meeting house, shared meals, helped one another navigate this new, precarious freedom. Magnolia and Ezra's relationship settled into something neither of them had words for. Not romance, not servitude, not quite friendship in the traditional sense. It was a bond forged in trauma and survival, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, defined by the simple fact that they'd saved each other's lives and chosen to keep walking the same path. They ate meals together, discussed plans for the garden and the cottage, read books aloud by lamplight. Ezra taught Magnolia how to chop wood properly, how to tell when chickens were about to lay, how to read the weather by watching the sky. Magnolia taught Ezra history, mathematics, how to write letters, and keep accounts. They carved out a life that made sense to them, even if it looked strange to outsiders. Meanwhile, the South began to whisper. Rumors spread about the Pritchard plantation, about the mysterious deaths of Silas Pritchard and his overseer, about the enslaved people who'd vanished overnight, about the daughter who'd disappeared without a trace. Some said it was a curse, that the plantation had been built on cursed ground, that spirits had risen up in vengeance. Others claimed it was a scandal, that Magnolia had run off with a lover, that Silas had been murdered by business rivals. A few suspected something closer to the truth, but those voices were quickly silenced. The idea of enslaved people orchestrating their own liberation was too dangerous to speak aloud in polite Southern society. The plantation stood empty. slowly reclaimed by kudzu and weeds, a ghost of what it had been. No one knew the real story. No one except the people who'd lived it. And they weren't telling. Evening fell over the cottage. Magnolia sat on the porch in a wooden rocking chair Ezra had repaired. She held a book in her lap, a collection of poetry she'd found at the general store. Ezra sat on the porch steps. His hands rested on his knees. His face was relaxed, peaceful in a way it had never been before. Magnolia opened the book, found the page she'd marked, began to read aloud. Her voice was soft but clear. The words floated out into the cooling air, settled over the garden where tomatoes and beans grew in neat rows. Ezra listened, closed his eyes, let the sound wash over him. Around them, the world they'd built rested quietly. Strange, untraditional, fragile, but free. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.